I just think that the concept of men being unfairly portrayed in media is a far-right talking point elicited by insecure men. So please, as men, can we stop the victimization? We are not victims.
Men were 2 times more likely to be shown as incompetent, 1.5 times more likely to be emotionally abusive on TV, and 4 times more likely to be physically abusive. The way that men are portrayed as fathers doesn't give men an out. It doesn't give them an option or an opportunity to be better than the alternative. My name's Dominick DiCesare. I'm taking the position that men are unfairly portrayed in the media. I'm a Catholic father of 2 children, and that's pretty much it. That's, I think, important for me. I'm nobody else special.
All right, cool. Hi, my name is Hunter Sweeney. I make music under the moniker Sweeney, and I'm also a YouTuber. I make elevated video essays on a multitude of different topics. And yeah, I'm currently arguing that men are not unfairly portrayed in the media. Thank you for having me. All right, well, thank you guys for having me. Now, obviously, the question is, are men unfairly portrayed in media? I think it's important to start out with how men are portrayed in media. So first, I'll go over potential negatives that those from your side may claim exist, and then analyze the validity of those sentiments. And then I'll quickly touch on the positives, since that also matters for the scenario. First, some may claim that the morality and actions of men have been called into question recently, mostly on the news and social media. And typically, those stem from women voicing how they feel unsafe around men. I'm sure you know about the famous bear and man in a woods scenario, where women claim that they would rather be alone in the woods with a bear than a man. And yeah, as a man, I'm sure you might think that's ridiculous. But studies do show that 93 to 99% of sexual assaults are committed by men, 90% of murders are committed by men, and 96.8% of domestic homicide suspects are male. So yeah, I personally see why men would be why women would be fearful of men, but maybe that's just me. Secondly, is the idea that men objectify and over-sexualize women. Now, I don't know about you, but in my own personal life, I've directly talked to women about this issue, and there's not a single woman in my life who has not faced sexual harassment in some form throughout their life by men. Additionally, I'm a guy who's been around many men, and I, just like you, I assume, have seen how men can crudely speak about women and their bodies behind closed doors. But aside from those anecdotal experiences, studies also show that over 90% of men watch pornography as opposed to 60% of women, and approximately 81% of women have reported that they've experienced some form of sexual harassment or assault in their lifetime. This all in addition to the over-sexualization of women online. So yeah, I would say that this one is justified, in my opinion. Now I can quickly touch on how men are positively portrayed in the media. Men are seen as strong and motivated individuals. They're also seen as the breadwinners of the family, which is backed by wage gap statistics. They're seen as leaders in the world, as 80 to 85% of current world leaders are men. And ultimately, they're the leading voice in both business, life, and the media, as they control the narrative in our current patriarchy. So yeah, I would say that men are pretty fairly portrayed in media today.
Thanks you for Hunter for going through that. I think actually that's a good reason for me to start with what I wanted to discuss, which was what I believe to mean when I say men are unfairly portrayed. And so I want to define what I say fairness is not, to help kind of help to describe that. So I don't believe when I say that men are unfairly portrayed, I'm not defining fairness as perfectly representative of reality. I'm not defining fairness as more pro-conservative. I'm not defining it in such that I'm suggesting that women are portrayed fairly. I don't think that the fairness of men's portrayal depends on women's portrayal. I'm also not suggesting that men are not responsible for this unfairness themselves. Nor do I think fairness should be revenge for the past. So, we were portrayed this way, so now we should be portrayed that way. I do, however, think the unfairness does mean that men are villainized and are flanderized for drama, political points, etc. And I do believe that men are harmed by their portrayal in the media, including in ways that, such as you already discussed, you mentioned pornography. I think that pornography is an unfair portrayal of men. Pornography often depicts men, first off, as you mentioned, pornographic media is a hugely consumed by men and often targets men. It usually portrays a level of virility that is unachievable for the typical man. And we see that there's a rising erectile dysfunction in men. that may be related to this heavy pornography use. Correlation studies have been done to conduct this. On top of that, along with what you were suggesting around those kind of portrayals of men in sex, 63% of men suggest that media portrays that they should never or would never say no to sex, which is, I think, an unfair portrayal towards men's habits there. I don't believe men should not say no to sex. They should and ought to say no to sex on many occasions. They shouldn't be pressured into having it and feel like there's this unnecessary need to be a sexual man. So I think in those respects, things are unfairly portrayed. You can argue that even in the past, that even the very sexual, hyper masculine men like James Bond, for example, were actually sometimes depicted as saying no to women. They would reject women, where you don't see that as much today of the men rejecting the women. You see men wanting to clamor after sex. So that would be kind of the first thing that I would want to tackle.
Sorry, I did want to just address that real quick, because you said that in your reasoning you cited that I think you said 61% of men feel that they don't have the ability to say no, or they feel pressured to say yes to sexual encounters. And my question would be, is that the fault of the media? Is that the media unfairly portraying men, or is that just men having their own thoughts on the situation?
So that is a 60. So this is a 2017 study performed in Canada. That 63% of, and this is adolescent boys, that the study was done with adolescent boys. 63% of them said media portrays that real men should never and would never say no to sex, despite the fact that I would say 23. I think I don't remember. I didn't write this number down, but it was something in the 20s. Percentage said that they actually feel that is true, like that they actually ought to do that. They think that's a good thing. So they at least feel unfairly represented in that way. They think media tells them, go out, go and have sex. You should do it. And yeah, if somebody comes up, yeah, sex is awesome, and you would never say no to sex, right? You're a stud, aren't you? I don't think that's a fair representation towards men.
Sorry, real quick. So if you don't think that that's a fair representation towards men, do you have any examples of any media that does portray pressure for men to say yes in sexual scenarios?
I think that the pressure naturally comes from, for example, pornography, I think, is a great example. I think it probably there's, I couldn't name you the exact porno videos themselves. Sorry, I don't have that catalog, but I think it's very often that the man is portrayed as like there's a woman who's coming in to seduce him, and it's like, come on, oh, do this thing, and he's like, oh, I guess I have to. That's probably a major portrayal. I would also argue the manosphere. The media is not just TV and news. Media is also the things that we see in social media. And there is a large consort of men who feel that social media, young men, the GOAT agency did a survey that 52% of young men say damaging stereotypes of masculinity in social media in particular. And 62% believe that positive male role models are overlooked by the brands and press, often focusing on the Andrew Tate's horrible kind of masculine features or the Fresh and Fit podcasts rather than positive masculine role models. So your options are either the very submissive feminist man or the Andrew Tate, all women are bad kind of. You're given two choices, and you're not really given a fair pick of what men look like. That's what I would say.
Okay, cool. I think like a big thing for me is obviously this comparison that you keep making, that you said that like women not being fairly represented in media is not necessarily comparable to men, or like it doesn't matter in the terms of this conversation. I think it does. I think the two are very closely connected, considering we're talking about gender, and I'm personally like a trans supporter, so I don't necessarily believe in the concept of only two binaries. But in this, we're specifically talking about two binaries of men and women. And I think that's comparable, because obviously you can say, we can make this argument for anything. You can say like anything is unfairly portrayed in the media, but we're talking about generalizations here. We're talking about the gender as a whole. And we're also talking about the gender in comparison to the other. So you make the statement, because I'm not here to be like, there's no sexual pressure on men to agree to sex. No, I definitely think that is a thing in our society. I think that is a thing even more so for women. which I think is caused by men. And I think that's where a lot of like this tug and pull comes from, because we can be like, oh, these are examples for why men are portrayed unfairly in the media. And then I can go back and give you 2 or 3 more examples of why women are unfairly portrayed in media because of men that are attached to these issues. So such as the sexualization. There's such a huge sentiment online about how men can get like baited by women into like sexual assault cases, how it's women's fault and men aren't at fault for these scenarios, even though statistics show otherwise. And I would say, if we're talking about the concept of sexual pressure and the ability to say no, I would 100% that women have far more pressure to say yes to sexual scenarios than men, given all the statistics about sexual assault, etc., within like both domestic or like both in relationships and apart from it.
I mean, I think that's an interesting point that you bring up, relationships and apart from it. You talked about the barren man situation, and you're right that I do think it's somewhat ridiculous, but it's not because I think that women shouldn't, have genuine concern around certain types of men. Rather that most of the incidences of sexual assault against women, or in cases of rape or things like that, are from men who know them, men who are close to them. So the random man in the woods is probably less likely to get at you than the bear, so to speak. But I digress. That's kind of a side point. I think I get what you're saying. And so I would say that, yeah, I do. I mean, even if I were to approach it from the angle of saying that women have certain levels of unfair portrayal, which I do agree, but also that women get women get more support for that unfair portrayal, insofar as that, for example, the UN has had directives on how to discuss violence against women, suggesting that violence involving women should always be reported by female journalists. There's no such directive for men. There has never been any directives on how to report violence, or especially sexual violence, towards men. There's no concern for that. There's no help towards that in any way. We also see that typically women are promoted in particular ways to encourage to speak out about themselves. We see that in not just the portrayals of men, but also in how women have come back from media portrayals. So if there are these negative stereotypes, it's the fact that through these negative stereotypes, women read more, they outperform men in musical and artistic ability. There's more women in men than uni. Boys are 3 times more likely to be in special ed. They're 4 times more likely to get an ADHD diagnosis, and they commit suicide at a higher rate. And Helen Liu, in a 2020 study, found that boys were significantly less likely than girls to note media stereotypes. So even if women suggest that there is more pressure, the problem is that men aren't even noticing these things and noticing the things that harm them in many ways.
Yeah, for sure. I do want to touch on more of the cultural aspect in terms of like social media. I'm on social media, you're on social media, we've both been on Jubilee. I'm sure you know about the culture that is around, like on Twitter especially, about the whole concept of, I feel like the manosphere is very much like globalized at this point. I feel like we're in a day and age where people are becoming more supportive of like Andrew Tate types, of misogyny, of putting down women to uplift men. And my main gripe is us as men victimizing ourselves with far bigger issues in mind. I think that the misogyny on the internet is far bigger of an issue than men potentially being unfairly portrayed in certain circumstances. If you want to say, like, in my opinion, if you are standing on the concept that men are being unfairly portrayed in media, you are taking away the idea and the attention from women who are being victimized by these men. And usually a lot of these talking points and a lot of these reasons for why they're unfairly portrayed are incombatants and against what women are saying that they're experiencing. For example, like, could you address some of the points that I made, such as like the sexual violence, the misogyny, the over-sexualization, purely on the basis of like how men contribute to that? And because I think that is what I'm mainly arguing, is that men are, in a lot of the time, responsible for this. I think men are even responsible for them being unfairly portrayed in the media. I think toxic masculinity is a huge point of it. And you can say that, oh, you're just arguing that men are being unfairly portrayed, But I think also it is important in a nuanced conversation to address what is the cause of that.
I mean, well, yeah, I do agree that in a lot of cases, men are the reason that we're unfairly portrayed. I don't disagree with that. I think that men are unfairly portrayed, though. For that's the main point I'm trying to make. And I maybe to address further with like it's tough to address what exactly you're saying because there's, well, I mean, I think the focal point, for example, with the Andrew Tate types, the problems that they have with their level of misogyny. The other things that they often they often do as well is they disparage fatherhood. Just as much as I believe the other side disparages fatherhood, I believe that there's this dual disparaging of fatherhood. The media fixates on the manosphere, like we said, but they also and they talk about how these guys are bad, which I agree, they're bad, but they don't provide a good supplement because the opposite is the apprentice dad, the abusive dad, the absentee dad, the man box dad, the violent protector dad. A men's caregiving report in 2022 found that in recent years, caregiving between men and women were shown equally on television, but men were 2 times more likely to be shown as incompetent, 1.5 times more likely to be emotionally abusive on TV, and 4 times more likely to be physically abusive. The way that men are portrayed as fathers doesn't give men an out. It doesn't give them an option or an opportunity to be better than the alternatives, which is either, fathers are always bad and they're evil, or the guy who's saying don't be a father. And these are the options that men are given. They're not given a positive male role model. And the any kind of positive male role model we are given is often shot down. Even the positive masculine figures, it's kind of a cheesy one, but you look at the MCU, right? Marvel has been very popular over culture, and you look at all of the main male characters who arguably they had flaws, but they all rose above those flaws in really positive ways and empowered women. Iron Man, the Hulk, Captain America, Thor. But what happened to all of those major characters? Killed, weakened physically, put into like a miniature form, sent back into the 50s to go live his life, basically killed.
I see your clocks right now, so I do want to just get some things off to get your responses. In terms of that, what you're saying about how there are like healthy representations of men in media, but they are torn apart. I think more so, at least in the general, I'm a film major, by the way. I watch a lot of movies. And in a general sense, I think upon mainstream movies, when they have a genuinely good representation of like a good man in a film, usually they show the vulnerabilities. And an example I'll give, even I think like Barbie. I think which is a silly example, but I think the character arc of Ken and showing how he was able to embrace his toxic masculinity, etc. It really shows like the humility that men should operate within, the perspective that they should see from like a woman's perspective, etc. But 9 times out of 10, when we get these types of stories, men online end up being the ones to tear it down. They call it woke. They call it propaganda. They say that this isn't what it means to be a real man. They go back to the Sigma edits, et cetera, et cetera. And again, it all comes back to the cause of it. And the whole concept of fairness in the portrayal of media, I think really has to do with what these men are doing to create that portrayal. Because at that point, we have to ask ourselves the question, is it unfair if it is reality?
Yeah, you know what? And here's something I think you and I probably partially agree on, which is that like the depiction of Ryan Gosling in Barbie. How many men always every depiction of Ryan Gosling, once again, your film guy, the literally me meme, right? Like, oh, Ryan, he's literally me, right? This depiction of Ryan Gosling being the literally me guy. Why do men relate so heavily to like this kind of jaded, distant guy who like has to kind of work his way through? And why do they always like those characters? Why do they relate to Rorschach or the Joker when these are the bad guys, right? Perhaps it's because the choices, and I believe this wholeheartedly, that the choices of these characters are these are the struggles that these men ought to deal with, but they're never portrayed as, they're either usually portrayed as like,
I'm sorry, you have 30 seconds. I want to give you the chance to respond to this because it's going to be a little, I want to give you time. While doing my research, I found a tweet by you that called for the murder of a fellow political streamer, Hassan Piker. I don't know about the audience, but I find these particular calls to violence to be dangerous and wrong. So for this debate, how can we trust you or any sources you cite when it's clear your ethics may be compromised?
Sure. I'm guessing you're probably talking about my most recent tweet, which was not actually a call for the death of Hassan Piker, but was a satirical post referencing Samuel Hyde saying, Hassan Piker, I'm coming to kill you in your house in Los Angeles. And then also referencing Destiny, suggesting it was okay. Both of which I don't like Destiny. I'm not a fan of what he said. I don't like him. So my whole point there was a satirical comment. I post on my Twitter funny things. I don't make things serious. I'm not a serious guy on Twitter.
All right, yeah, I got a minute 25, so I will just say that I think the entirety of this conversation really revolves around, is it true what people say men are doing in the media? I think there's this entire zeitgeist of women being put down in support of men. We're seeing that people think men are better in a multitude of things when there's an abundance of things that women are better at that people don't talk about. I think women are way better at dancing. They have better taste in music. They're more compassionate. What do men have? They're good at grilling. I don't know. But I just think that the concept of men being unfairly portrayed in media is a far right talking point elicited by insecure men. I'm not necessarily saying that as a dig. I'm a man who has insecurities of my own, and I can understand where these fears come from. I think as a society, we should focus more on addressing the root of the problem, which is within the men themselves and their current perspective on both women and the world around them. We spent this whole conversation talking about men, but what about the women? Women have to spend every day knowing that misogyny runs wild in the media. They have nowhere to hide. Over-sexualization, objectification, workplace discrimination, bullying, their own bodily rights being debated online by those who don't share their experiences. Those like you and me. So please, as men, can we stop the victimization? We are not victims, at least not in the way that we are trying to claim. Support the fight against misogyny, support the elimination of the patriarchy, and most of all, please, please support women.